Our last but not least presenter this morning is Daniel Foliard. Daniel is an historian whose core interest is on modern European imperialism and their visual archives. His first book, Dislocating the Orient, British Maps and the Making of the Middle East, 1854-1921, was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2017. His second one, translated into English in 2022 and published by Manchester University Press, is titled The Violence of Colonial Photography, and I highly recommend it. He recently published with Julien Schuh Passés, contestés et présents numériques, or Contested Past and Digital Presence, and he is currently coordinating a collaborative research project, iVision, which he presented yesterday, on the application of computer vision to the photographic archive of early news image agency. And as you probably know, Daniel is also a main partner in the organization of this conference. His lecture today is titled Historical Work as Pharmacology on Synthetic Visual Archives and the Transformation of the Past. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Foliard.
Thank you, Thierry. Yes, that's me again. So don't worry, I'll be sure. All right. So it's going to be a broader take on what generative AI does to our perception of the past. And I'm going to go all French theory. I apologize in advance, but I can't do that, right? I'm French. And we're going to start with a concept that Derrida used in a very esoteric text called Plato's Pharmacy. If you understand what Derrida meant in that text, please tell me. But he revived a very important concept dating back to Plato's Phaedrus, a Greek concept called pharmakon. And in that text, Plato uses the myth of Zeus, the Egyptian god of writing, that you can see on this document here. Zeus gave writing to Thamus, the king of Egypt, arguing that it was a very powerful way to inscribe memories. So the main argument in the myth is that writing is essentially a technology of memory. And the word used to describe writing in the text is pharmakon. And pharmakon in ancient Greek is at the same time means a negative act, some kind of sacrifice that can offer protection, and something that is also potentially a cure, so something that is both poison and remedy. And the point of Plato, and that Derrida points out, is that writing is essentially something that can be deceiving. And that's what Thamus is saying to the god of writing. He's telling him, yes, you think it's a gift, but it's actually poison. Because that technology of memory is going to make people dumber. It's going to externalize memory, and people will forget. They will not tell the stories of the past using language. And that's actually a very good point. In the 19th century, specialists of oral traditions in the Balkans realized that some of the poets in the Balkans could remember at least 20,000 verses of the myth, the founding myth in the Balkans, just like the Homer poems would be recited by people without a change in any word and in any pose. I suggest today to look at AI as a sort of pharmakon, right? So to maybe not to be a prophet of doom, maybe not to be too techno-optimistic, but to try and see where history can play a part in trying to accommodate these technologies. And yes, Egyptologists amongst us will have realized that's fake generated Egyptian papyrus. So a few months back, I was looking at this Instagram account called What If AI, which is about alternative histories and alternative visions of histories, and came across this project at King's College, very smartly using the concept of synthetic pasts and deep nostalgia. The King's College project was very much about how algorithmic production of the past could change the way our collective memory, historical writing, and even individual memory could work. Some of these channels are very popular, much more popular than podcasts in history or Instagram account by a museum. This one is particularly bad. So initially you're reassured it's about the Irish famine. So you've got this strange glow of the AI-generated image, the plastic texture of faces, the weird facial composition of some of the kids. So initially what the first diagnostic you could, the first analysis you can make is that most of that use is going to be playful, a sort of distraction, basically, and not mess with our collective memories. Another example is the work of John Muller. He's another very popular producer of alternative views of the past. It's usually kind of neutral and playful. He's also using a function on Photoshop that can expand the frame and create what's outside the image in a way that is very striking. It's a function that is embedded in Photoshop. So these are generated pseudo photographs with no actual reference. So there's no underlying event, the generata that Julien was talking about. And also, I don't know how you feel about these photos, but there's no punctum in the sense that Roland Barthes talked about it. There's nothing disrupting the reading in the image, right? It's just a statistical construction. But some of them are hard to unsee, right? They get in your brain to an extent and produce something very powerful. So another example would be videos using reference to the mimetic, realistic, mechanical image. This one is very striking in the sense that it's a completely stereotyped version of what the plague could be in the 14th century Europe. I don't know why you would wear plastic gloves.
It's
anyway.
Okay, they are in a better place.
So it might seem completely harmless in the sense that it's very distracting, playful. There's a restaurant in Toronto, I won't have time to go there, where you've got tournaments and I don't know what it's called, it's a medieval. We've got that in France a lot. So it seems pretty harmless, except if you're a historian, you know that uses of the past are rarely completely neutral. This example of somebody producing an Elon Musk in armor and is much fitter than it is in real life, actually, will remind everybody that the fascists are usually very interested in the Roman Empire and references to the past. So there's a point where toxicity kicks in the way these images are produced and creates connections between the past and the present. Should we enter a sort of moral panic, thinking that, and I was very interested by the yesterday's keynote, but I think we shouldn't go too far in prophesizing doom as to the effect of these images on our collective memories. The main problem, actually, is a sort of capitalistic issue. If you go on Adobe or on some of the stock websites that are selling photographs, it's very, very easy to get these photos that you see here. They cost, for full use in an exhibition, I think they cost only $50 to $60, right, to print them, to use them commercially. And all of them, I think you realize, are all generated images. And what is interesting is that professionals are starting to buy them, right? So there's an actual competition that is happening between traditional archives, with sometimes, let's face it, as a historian, I sometimes struggle with that. The price to pay to reproduce some of these images in our book is very, very high, right? These non-copyrighted images that are generated by AI are creating a sort of competition as to what images of the past can be used in publications and documentaries. And very recently, the association, the Archival Producers Alliance of the US, has officially said that it was kind of okay to use such images in their historical documentaries, right? So I think it's a worrying trend where AI-generated synthetic archives that look like potential actual relations to the past are becoming much cheaper on the market than actual photographs or documents from the past that are well curated. So I don't think it's of little consequence, given the fact that it's actually, as you know, a rise of deepfakes and potentially harmful material in the works. There was a recent report by UNESCO on the generation of toxic pasts around the Holocaust. Okay, so there's a rise in manipulation of images, of production of realistic images that will create literally an alternative reality of what happened during the Second World War. But I think the main toxic aspects of potential toxicity of that generated AI production for us, both museums and historians, is the overflow. The pace of production of these images, we are basically drowning in that fast generation of images. And to the point where, as you can see on this graph, more AI-generated images have been created in the last 2 years, basically, than what photography produced over time. So there's definitely an issue here in terms of how we can make our images exist in that environment. So pace is an unprecedented problem. It took, for portrait photography, it took somewhere between 20 to 30 years to actually transform the market for portraiture in Europe in the 19th century. The family album took 30 to 40 years as well to get installed. We are surrounded by these images that are literally recreating a different relation to the past. So there's here a first problem, I think, in terms of institutional understanding of what we should do in front of that. The other potential toxicity, I think, is how that flood of images is modifying the way we think about the past and we perceive the past. And there's a very important reference here that I think you know, is Krakauer's vision of what was happening in the 1920s, 1930s, in the face of one of the first mass photo inflations between the two wars. And obviously, Krakauer's pessimism was connected to the political evolution of what was going on in Europe at that point, right? As you know, he had a vision that photography was extremely fragmentary. Its capacity to recall memories was very limited. And that created a consumption of images that basically produced citizens that were not really able to cope with the amount of information that was produced by the news, making them easier subjects for illiberal regimes and potential tyranny. And I think AI is literally doing that right now, right? It's transforming the way we think about our individual memories and how collectively we understand that. The thing is, and I'm a cultural historian, and we always say that, but it's true, it's not the first time, right? It's inscribed in a long history, and the first presentations have been very clear about this, in a long history of encoding the image, transforming the image, right? So in terms of analyzing the disruption today, I think we should think about what happened before we overestimate the transformation and the disruption. And the historical analogy is not that bad, right? As I think I demonstrated yesterday with our early 20th century photos, the transformation of the authentic photo into something that was mass consumed was enormous. Look at the transformation and encoding that was inscribed in the published images in the press now. So I think we should distance ourselves from moral panics, right, in terms of what AI is going to do. Another example of early encoding, as you know, is telephotography, which transformed the image pretty well. There was also a period to adopt collectively the consequences of the acceleration of the circulation of things. And in terms of how the mass data sets that are currently used by generative AI are presented by their creators and their users, there's actually not a big difference with how in the 19th century sometimes saw photography. You've got tons of projects, colonial projects to collect faces, geographical projects to photograph entire places. In a sense, we are in the continuity of these discourses of progress of the 19th century, where the big companies basically are rehashing the same traditions of taxonomic impulses of photography. And complete illusions of totality, I'm going to go back to this, right? Where when you look at ImageNet, it's a pitiful understanding of what an image is, let's face it. And Lion 5B has a huge mass of late 20th century, early 21st century images, but it's very limited in variety, materialities, and languages. That's a poster from a French exhibition where you've got promises of looking at the entire world from the microscopic to the macro. And what we get usually, and you know that if everybody's interested in the visual, if you prompt generative AI, what you're going to get is a sort of mix of the subconscious of that visual culture rather than anything really significant in terms of connecting you to the past. It basically connects you to the past that is synthesized in these things. As far as facial recognition, Dhruva was showing faces that didn't exist. That's also inscribed in a long obsession of photography dating back to the 19th century. You've probably heard about Francis Galton's composite images, where he would try to create the face, the theoretical face of a criminal. There's older versions of this with Cesare Lombroso's attempts to figure out what a criminal would look like. Lombroso was one of the first specialists of forensic expertise. But it has consequences on how we look at one another, right? It transforms the way we understand faces. It still has consequences and modifies relationships in real society, as it did in the 19th century. Now, if we take a look at the constitution of these data sets and how they produce the images, I think we need to understand, and I know I'm using the quantum analogy far too much, right? But that's a pretty cool photo. It's an Einstein ring, basically. So it's the light of a star that is hidden behind the black hole, right? And that's on the fringe. You can see tiny fragments of the light that is coming from behind this huge gravitational force. And I think these big data sets that are basically that are based on our archival digitized material are working as gravitational holes, hiding the light basically behind them. My point is, in this complex analogy with quantum theory, our data sets, what we've digitized so far is very limited actually in terms of representing what mimetic mechanical images are. And part of what was photographed is completely absent from these data sets, right? And it creates intense effects in how generative AI can produce results that are actually actionable in reality. And I'm going to use 3 concepts to describe that. They will produce effect of hypermnesia in the sense that you're going to have a focus on certain iconized moments in the history of photography that has been digitized, right? So generative AI on the plague, for instance, because of the movies produced, is going to create that vision of the Middle Ages, of the 14th century as a dark age of horror and destruction, though not completely untrue for the 14th century, but exaggerates the importance of some visualization. So I tried on Midjourney recently, I tried to produce a prompt trying to synthesize, for instance, mass violence in the 20th century. And if you look at the subconscious that is brought on the surface by the creation of the image, there's, for me, I don't know, we can discuss that, right? But echoes of the Spanish Civil War, definitely, right? Echoes of racial violence in the US, probably. As if there's no notion of Africa anywhere in that production of mass violence. And I tried time and time and time again, right? So what generative AI is going to produce in terms of synthesized past is very limited, actually, in how. So you've got here a sort of phenomenon of hypomnesia, in the sense key mass violence events for our historiographies and collective memories will have a sort of very huge visibility, whereas it's a lot less true for others. Hypomnesia is the opposite of that, obviously, sort of impaired memory. So as more and more people are probably going to use these tools, I think, for teaching purposes, I can anticipate my students, if the systems are working well, recording me during the class, and then using that text to produce a sort of documentary, maybe. So text to video, to try and review a class or produce something that is easier to digest, right? So I think we ineluctably gonna go to these changes in mediation, right? And the problem is the data sets are really producing these very distorted visions of the past and phenomenon of hypomnesia. Worst is probably the amnesia, which is, for instance, in France, very visible as far as the colonial past is concerned, right? And we, as historians and institutions, we really need to take that into account. Because if we look at how, let's face it, I'm sorry, but engineers look at what images are, this is pitiful, right? There's this notion of a 2D image, where we know for contested past, in particular, for very difficult past, the most important image is the one that has been destroyed. So an example here, for instance, is an album from the head of the Treblinka camp. The album was seized just before his trial, and somebody had 2 images have disappeared from the album. Somebody took them, right, before the album was given to the allies for the trial. And there's a caption that is erased, Schön, beauties. So one can only imagine what the image was, probably damning evidence of maybe sexual violence against some of the Jewish women in the camp. So my point is to say, historical intervention has to complicate the notion of what an image is in this context more and more. Another example, we're working on the 1867 exhibition, I was mentioning that yesterday, is the actual weight. You've just touched a stereoscopic viewer. The importance of the object as a socializing element, right, in an exhibition, how mimetic images can also trigger discussions by their materiality and physical presence, right? So what can we do? I just generated this image on ChatGPT in September, and the prompt was, create an image showing people living in their individual memory bubbles. Here we are, and I realized maybe that's me outside the bubble. ChatGPT is sending a message. So this guy in a suit holding a light, is he trying to guide somebody out of the bubble and make people talk together or something like this? So maybe a secret message from Altman and the other. But more seriously, I think historical work is very much about creating commons for a discussion on the past, right? So I think that the discussion we had the last 3 days is very much about us getting our hands in the dirt to try and figure out what we can do with the pharmacon, right? To learn some kind of know-how, to understand how these technologies, infrastructures are working without fearing them too much, to figure out solutions to recreate a space where polarization and stupid visions of the past sometimes can be set aside for something common. It poses very important questions, and I don't have any answers, on how history should be written today, right? Should we embrace, for instance, generative AI as historians or museums? For instance, is it completely stupid to imagine that collectively maybe we set our university competitions aside and work on collective projects to maybe design a generative AI computer vision system that might be a little more interesting than what the GAFAMs are producing, right? So for instance, something that would have traceability, sealed information in the produced image, information about hallucinations, etc., etc. So typically, something that might, in a small way, because I understand it's we've got limited means, right? Face that production of images that are very, very potentially dangerous, right? So thinking also about developing generative AI system for text, our students are going to use them, right? We're using them. That are not in the hands of these companies, right? Because the data is very, very often our property. Typically, 2 of my books are on LibGen and have been eaten by OpenAI to train their systems as much as many of my colleagues, I believe, right? So one of the ways as historians is probably to get these tools back in our hands to a certain extent, right? And to create in the limit, with the means we have, systems that can contradict this. It's also very important to think about historical writing in general. And that's just an opinion, it's open for discussion. But we've been writing these last 20, 30 years very much in the shape and form of what the STEM science are doing. The shape of our articles and publications of fundamental research are aesthetically too close, I think, to what the STEM sciences are doing. History is a science, make no mistake. But its intervention on the past is also about rememoration, right? It's also creating emotions, it's also creating something more than just a conclusion on a problem, right? When you recirculate a photo, when you choose to show something, it's not just about reaching a completely irrational conclusion. You're producing an effect, potential effect on collective memory. So my thinking is new forms might have to be developed to actually articulate history in a way that is relevant to these new technologies of memories, right? Not to fight them off, but to work with them and create a new space there. And I think Elspeth yesterday made that remark, and it's been on the back of my mind for a long, long time, is how do we try to negotiate these new vocabularies and these new ways of recirculating images and talking about them with artists? I think the avenue of collaborations between research and creation are very interesting. Just to give you an example of how artistic intervention can create a new space for dialogue, it's the amazing work of Timotheus Anggawan Kusno. He's an Indonesian artist. He'll be at the Festival de Cannes, I think, in May. He's an amazing artist working specifically with historians. And his work on wildfire, in particular, uses generative AI to disrupt the narrative of the Indonesian counter-communist massacres in the 1960s, 1970s. And it's amazing work because he uses generative AI to fill the gaps of the archives, right? So to create images that never existed and that were lost. So synthetic pasts that are close to how he would like to commemorate the lost albums and images of his family, destroyed by the regime at that point. And what is very interesting is how he uses these images in the shape and form of old photographic systems. So he's not just producing the images, but in the exhibition, you're looking at generated images on 8mm films, what looks like facsimile of albums from the 1960s. So I think it's a wonderful way to try and do something useful to an extent with this and engage in discussion on AI. I'm going to close the loop. Did I talk too much? Is it good? Going back to Plato. I think interesting in talking, was good. And I think the last 3 days have shown that it's very important to look at these images and think about it, but speaking is absolutely essential. So maybe I'm a bit naive, but I was very glad to be with you for these 3 days, to be able to engage in all these discussions and to see one another face-to-face around coffees and wonderful discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much for your approach to these new images that we're going to have to deal with. Do you have questions, comments? Yes, please.
Thank you, Danielle, for bringing up an enormously important point. What do we believe? What don't we believe in the future? The authenticity of what's done and scanned and everything else. It sounds like an enormous problem because humans, by definition, will misuse or even accidentally or on purpose any technology that they're thrown at. And also, even in sound, I have personal, I was an editor for the news department, and they often wanted to put sound as part of this discussion. For instance, a politician walks in a room, is he cheering sound or booing sound? Same picture. It adds a whole new dimension. We're all emotional creatures, so we look and think. I'm making a speech of my own. So my question is there a way to determine authenticity in the way it was done in the first place, almost like an artist who has signed copies of his work and so on, to not allow fakes to take over our lives? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's on the back of my mind. We discussed that with Karen Strassler recently, and she was saying, is truth that important in the way we relate to these images? We need to look at them as process, and AI is just another layer of that process. But if you go down that road entirely, right, it opens new question. So as a joke, in a way, not a very good joke maybe, but maybe the indexical interlude is over, right? The idea that photography introduced, that we could have some kind of positivistic relation to the visual past, it's gone to an extent. Strangely enough, with consequences, and might be bifurcating, but I'll go back to your consequences on photographs and how we relate to them, right? The Frankfurt School, remember, in the age of reproducibility, was saying, photographs, there's this lack of emotion and aura. And I don't know about you, but more and more actual photographs, daguerreotypes, or even stereotypes are getting back some kind of that aura in an age where generated images are rebalancing our relation to these images of the past. I still think, that there's a relation to the truth that needs to be established, but we're facing something that is very difficult. It's an infrastructural change. Everybody's marked by this. We need to spend more time with images, I think. I tried to do it as a historian. We need to do it on a grassroots level, which takes time, right? I was in a French high school before I came there, trying to meet with people and take the time. So I think that we don't live in a post-truth environment. We were always, I don't really believe in that post-truth deep fake kind of stuff, right? In the sense, and that's another major question, and the keynote by the artist yesterday was very interesting on PsyOps. I don't really believe people are that gullible. I don't know if you remember the story of Stalin erasing the Commissar. Mm-hmm. Everybody knew that the Commissar was in the picture. Nobody really believed that it's a bad fake. Stalin was just saying, I can erase you if I want, right? It was a performance of a tyrant saying, and it's the same thing with the likes of Musk and people like this. They're just telling you, so the people that don't want to see are just supporting them, basically. There's no innocence there, right? Propaganda doesn't really work like this. Remember, most of the propaganda produced by the Nazis in the 1930s were stupid musicals and stuff. Everybody in the classrooms are using the ultra anti-Semitic films produced by the Nazis. People didn't look at that. They just look at bad images like this, distraction, right? They knew very well, propaganda works in a different way. So that relation to truth, it's always a fight, and I think historical work has to really intervene there as a way to make images more substantial in the public discussion.
Great. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Great lecture. So interesting. Thank you. But I really prefer your alternative to what I believe is an EU requirement that's coming out very soon, or has come out, where you have to label AI-generated images as such. But I think taking control of AI-generated images within a discipline is also extreme. I think it's an even better way of dealing with it. What is your point of view on labeling or taking control?
The problem is it's not a problem, it's a solution as well. Any watermarking solution will be bypassed by a system at one point, right? So I believe it's important, right? But listening to a YouTube conversation on that new regulation for documentaries, people were already saying, yeah, if you start writing AI-produced, people are going to get distracted from the main. So I'm sure that in 5 to 10 years, the mention of AI everywhere is going to disappear, right? Mechanically, because in terms of production, adding text to an exhibition, you know that, right? You don't want text in the middle of an image because you want the information far away from the image, not to distract people. But it doesn't matter because in face of deep fakes, we can maybe think about deep truth systems, right? So I don't agree with Lequin, very optimistic. Yann Lequin is the head of Meta and has this typical engineering Hegelian vision of technology. It's all going to solve by itself. It's not going to work like this unless I think a good attempt, that I'm not going to create another funded project, but a good attempt would be to create a generative AI engine based on curated collections that could contradict and produce some kind of experience that would go against what ChatGPT's Midjourney are doing, basically. That would be a nice experiment to say that's us trying to manage that data for ourselves. And even generative text, right? That would be amazing. All the universities in the world recreating a republic of letters to fight against authoritarian people, and you can seek refuge in France and then we can seek refuge in Canada if things go bad, right? To find a new territory for our historical work, that's part of the reason why we're here, right? We need to get together, people, right? Because it's bad times, right?
Thank you. Paul?
Yeah. I have a question about copyright. Copyright seems to me, I'll base this even a little bit on the evidence of a couple of your slides, seems to me it's almost collapsed as a protocol for monetizing images, but it's still used as a cudgel by people trying to monetize images, and it is also something that slows the use of images where, in our case, we're at a university, we have a legal department, and they, of course, are very risk-averse of lawsuits. But for many years, it seemed like copyright was mobilized whether people had legitimate claim to it or not. And now, with the generation of these images that are based on training, right? In other words, the AI has been trained by images, so that if you look at the image in the lower left there, you feel almost like you're looking at something done in the style of David Douglas Duncan, or you see an image that looks like it's out of a particular issue of National Geographic in the 1980s. Anyway, there are some copyright lawsuits that are underway from the people who generated original material, which they seem to know was used to train models. And I am curious what you think the prospects are for that kind of lawsuit. I will just say briefly that copyright is a laborious process, the adjudication of copyright even more laborious. Sometimes these cases take years to resolve. And I'm guessing that the people who are monetizing these images at a lower price and not using copyright, or maybe they are. I mean, for all I know, they are going to claim copyright over these images. My assumption is that they are not at all nervous about these lawsuits, but I'm curious what your thoughts are.
We need to litigate, I think, right? So that's above my pay grade, but we need to teach these systems a lesson. So when you think about OpenAI dumping all of LibGen material, apparently, right? There are clear avenues. The problem is part of the Trump's administration pressure on Europe, I think right now, is about making sure regulations on controlling data are more and more limited, okay? So there's definitely some kind, that's what we're doing, an educational part to make sure that everybody involved or suffering from that theft of data starts litigating more and more, right? It's going to take time, it's going to take money, but the prospects are good, right? Because there's no, Chantal was mentioning that, there's no precedent established in some of these areas right now. So it's very important in Europe, I think, to make sure the regulation, RGPD, stays in place to protect personal data, and that legislation doesn't become more and more open to this kind of theft, right? So I'm pretty optimistic, actually.
Great, thank you. And maybe a last comment here. Yeah, at the front row.
Thank you. I'm not that optimistic for the moment. My moral panic, I have moral panic. It is not related to the generation of synthetic images per se, or any of the new technology per se, but the political climate and what is being done with these images and the social impacts. So, of course, regulation is needed, and we often have legislation or legislators who are not up to the task in terms of even understanding what the implications are of all of this, but nevertheless, the real-world consequences are very important in terms of information. So, for example, the rollback in vaccination information is killing people, and so a very direct consequence of misinformation and disinformation. And the consequence, and at a moment when I also agree that post-truth has been around forever, and there are alternatives to that. But we have to deal with the social political implications of the moment that we are in, and the fact that, unfortunately, at a moment when regulation of technical information is more needed than ever before, we are in a moment when the threat to undo all of that has never been greater. So that's my concern. Oh, and I'm sorry, one other comment in relation to it. I was thinking about it yesterday when in the discussion, the group discussion yesterday afternoon, people were talking about the importance of collaboration, which is absolutely critical, of course, and your proposal for cross-university collaboration as well. DEI is a form of collaboration between peoples, intersectionality, the recognition of the commonalities and the human condition, etc., is also being super challenged right now and rolled back, and the backlash against women and against everybody who isn't part of the top-of-the-line bro culture. This is also under threat. So imagery is only one piece of this enormous, so we have to organize politically, I guess. That's the answer.
No, I completely agree on the fact that there's a window of huge danger in the next 2-3 years. I'm very well aware of that, because in France we're going to have a presidential election in 2 years. In Romania, they're calling for a new election. And as you know, online disinformation has played a huge part in the rise of the far-right candidates. So Europe could very well turn to complete alternative realities as far as the past is concerned. There's also a generational maybe aspect to this, right? Part of my optimism is I've got kids, and that generation is actually not as gullible as you might think. They immediately technically recognize generative AI. It's super interesting to see. They don't need sealed information. Just by the looks of it, they understand that something is going on that is either playful or harmful, right? So we need to look at spectatorships as well to understand what's going on. But yes, we're in a state of emergency. I completely agree, right? So my understanding was on a more long-term situation, right? The next 2-3 years are going to be critical, but hopefully it's going to work out well. Yeah.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much for your inspiring talk this morning.